culture is things, like I said, it's like eating certain foods because you're Korean, going to the Korean restaurant like once a month because you're adopted, celebrating certain holidays, like wearing the Korean hanbok. But race is really, understanding like what is racism, what is white privilege, and how to talk about racial discrimination. So like everyone's understanding of the adopted parents and adoptees understanding of Asians as a model minority and Asians as perpetual foreigners. And then even more specific stereotypes about Asian American women and Asian American young girls, which that conversation is not talked about usually. It's more so just focused on culture. So I think the first time I became conscious that I was a racial minority was in middle school. So before middle school, I really focused, my family really focused on culture. So that culturally, I come from a Korean background, and that Koreans do certain things, they eat certain foods and celebrate certain holidays. But even then, most of the conversations were not on race and how Asians experience racism in the United States. So in middle school, it's a predominantly white middle school. Even most of the other Asian kids were also adopted. And a lot of times in the hallways, other kids would call me these like so-called nicknames. So the first nickname that started was other kids would call me fried rice. And it's middle school, and I didn't know what to do. Because it's I want to fit in with other kids, but I'm also this is not okay. So at first I'm okay, maybe this is acceptable, but I'm no, this is not acceptable. And then them calling me fried rice escalated to them calling me things like chink and gook in the hallways. And I didn't really know what to do about it, just because there's not a lot of other Asian kids around me. So I went to the teachers and the counselors to say, this is happening in the hallways between classes, and it's really upsetting. But their only response was just to get over it. It's not a big deal. Most of the teachers were also white. And oftentimes, I would come home from school crying because of these things. But my adopted parents, they really struggled to understand. Why is this upsetting? What to do about it? They told me just to brush it off and ignore it. But if it keeps happening over and over again, if it's affecting my grades, I just can't ignore it. Well, I think they could accept that racial discrimination does exist. Because I don't think my parents even today fully accept that or fully understand what is racial discrimination. Because even today they're oh, if you become a doctor, if you become a professor, then you won't experience racism anymore because your category as someone who's elite in society will override racism. And they can't understand that it doesn't work that way. And they keep telling me that I'm wrong when I'm telling them no, I'll still experience racism. So I guess my parents accepting that they're not the experts on race. Understanding privilege is not easy. But for adoptive parents, I think it's something that would need to be done before they even think about adopting. Not an ad hoc decision, oh, I adopted this child of color, so now I need to learn about my white privilege. And that seems to be said, for people who, say, adopt a Chinese child. And then they're oh, I need to make a bunch of Chinese friends now. I'm if you don't already have Chinese friends, and you just are making Chinese friends because you've, adopted a kid from China, it's a little iffy. I think, through education, which would, I guess, primarily have to come through the adoption agencies. So the adoption agencies being the one to educate parents, they're not just adopting a child who, is from this country where they wear hanboks and eat kimchi. It's a little more complicated than that. But there's also, issues with adoption agencies and, adoptees not trusting adoption agencies. So, that needs to be worked out as well. But again, as I said, before you even choose to adopt, a child of color, thinking about, what that really means.